Good morning. I'm pleased to speak with you today about legal developments in the ongoing but certain to be unsuccessful attempt by Donald Trump and his allies to raise questions about the November election and to seek to overturn the results in his favor. And at the very outset, I would like to distinguish, if I could, between the appearance of great harm being done, and there is harm being done to the democratic process, and the actual reality of what could happen here in this election. The harm is real. There is, however, no chance whatsoever that Donald Trump can be successful in what it is that he is trying to do. We all know that democracy is a constitutional and legal process that functions in large part because we as a nation operate by a set of norms. Our elected officials operate as a set of norms. Our candidates operate under a set of norms. And all of this is defined by respect for the will of the people. And this year, we should be celebrating what election officials have done. In extraordinarily difficult circumstances in the middle of a pandemic, these election officials, assisted by thousands and thousands of volunteers who step forward to help, have created an opportunity for people to be heard in safe polling places, in mail programs put up rapidly to meet an enormous demand. In a number of ways unprecedented in the administration of our elections, these election officials, our voters, our volunteer poll workers have stepped up to make this election possible. And that's what we should be celebrating. What Donald Trump has done and is continuing to do is to denigrate and defame and deride this entire process and to allege to the American public that what they know in their hearts is not true is somehow true, and that the election that occurred on November 3rd, by which their voices was heard, was somehow illegitimate. And that's a serious, serious act of a president to do, unprecedented in presidential history. But rather than rely on my own wording, I just want to read, just to start with, before I turn to the hopeless legal position that Donald Trump is in, I want to read to you what Mitt Romney last night after 10 p.m. posted on this topic. Senator Romney of Utah, obviously a Republican, and the former party standard bearer for the presidency in 2012. He wrote, having failed to make even a plausible case of widespread fraud or conspiracy before any court of law, the president has now resorted to overt pressure on state and local officials to subvert the will of the people and overturn the election. It is difficult to imagine a worse, more undemocratic action by a sitting American president. And that is in fact true. It's hard to imagine anything worse. So it feels bad, it looks bad, and it's very, very damaging. But while the president and his allies are ripping at the fabric of the democracy in any way they can, the fabric is not tearing, it's holding firm. And so let's talk for a second about what's happening in particular with the focus in the press at the moment on the state of Michigan and what is taking place with the Trump strategy in Michigan. To understand Michigan, you have to put that particular state and what's taking place in the broader context of various challenges now over several weeks that the Trump campaign has been leveling at the electoral process. The Trump campaign and their allies have now lost a staggering 28 lawsuits in the 17 days since Election Day. And that comes on top of the 6 cases that had been dismissed that they had filed in the months previous. So from losing essentially once a month in court, they're now losing more than once a day, every 2 weeks. More than once a day, every day for 2 weeks since the election, they have been losing cases. In Michigan alone, they have brought 6 lawsuits in state and federal court complaining, as we often hear them do, about inadequate poll observation and challengers. And I can only cite you as an example of the problems that they're facing what one chief judge of the state trial court, a Republican, said, and that is that what they were saying on that subject, the inadequacy of control against fraud in the election, was an interpretation of events that was incorrect and not credible. And when a judge informs a party that what they are saying is interpretively incorrect and not credible, it is a polite, judge-like way of saying, I don't believe what you're saying. Just yesterday, by the way, the Trump campaign voluntarily dismissed 2 suits as soon as it became clear they were going to be called into court to defend their baseless allegations, and they would have had to stand before a judge and make their case, which they knew they could not do. This is taking place all over the country. In dismissing a case in Arizona on Wednesday, a state trial judge invited the defendant's Secretary of State to recover attorney's fees from the plaintiffs making these baseless allegations. And the statute under which those attorney fees would be recovered says that the attorney fees are available when a party, like the Trump campaign or their allies, brings or defends a claim without substantial justification, or brings or defends a claim solely or primarily for delay or harassment. It's very clear how the courts are receiving what Donald Trump is trying to peddle in the state. In Pennsylvania alone, the Trump campaign and its allies have lost 13 cases. And I could walk through each and every one of them. It would take far too much time. But I will say that everybody was treated the other day to the spectacle in the lead case in Pennsylvania, in which President Trump's lead lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, showed up completely unprepared for the case, did not know which judge he was speaking to, couldn't respond to simple questions about the governing law, and made baseless allegations over an extended rant to the court. Meanwhile, elsewhere, where serious state proceedings were taking place, the state trial court judge in Allegheny County rejected a lawsuit challenging 2,349 ballots. A state trial judge in Bucks County rejected a lawsuit challenging 2,177 ballots. Time and again, you see these claims crashing to the ground. And it is not only that the Trump campaign is losing the lawsuits, they're losing their lawyers. The lead lawyer in Pennsylvania, the lead law firm in West Pennsylvania, abruptly withdrew from the principal federal lawsuit in the state. It was replaced by a lawyer who then also withdrew. And the lead law firm for the Trump campaign in Arizona withdrew some time ago. So throughout this entire period of time, while the Trump campaign is failing in court, losing their lawyers, they are also unable to stitch together any kind of substantiated or coherent claim that fraud affected the outcome of the election. And of course, in the most dramatic moment, a failure on the Trump campaign's part and on the president's part, his own Department of Homeland Security concluded that this election, this very election that he's alleging was riven with fraud, was the most secure in American history. So he promptly fired the official in his own administration who had reached that expert conclusion. We could talk about other Republicans who've stepped forward, like that brave official, to challenge the Trump version of events here. Those include the lawyers who represented George W. Bush in the fabled Florida recount case in 2000. Those lawyers have said these claims are not credible. This case is no way like their case, and Trump's legal strategy is destined to fail. So it's in that context, in the context of just the complete ignominious collapse of the Trump's legal case across all of the states where the Trump campaign and their ever-shifting body of lawyers have been active. It is in that context that it's important to understand what's taking place in Michigan. There, in that state, Joe Biden stands at a margin of victory, 154,187 votes, that is more than 14 times Donald Trump's 2016 margin, which was 10,704. All 83 counties in Michigan certified their results on time this week. And the State Board of Canvassers meets on Monday to certify the statewide results. So what is Donald Trump doing as he sees the door about to slam totally shut on his fraudulent case about fraud? You've heard about two particular strategies you might pursue. One is to try to get the state legislature involved and have the state legislature wrest the control of the election from the voters and actually produce their own slate of Trump-Pence electors to send to the United States Congress. And you've also heard about attempts on the part of the Trump campaign to delay the certification of votes in Michigan and other states. Well, let me begin here by addressing state legislative intervention and any strategy built around that. No state legislature in our country's history ever has done what Donald Trump is apparently agitating for the Michigan state legislature to do, which is to ignore the results of a popular vote election and wrest control from the voters, or attempt to wrest control from the voters, and appoint their own slate of electors to send to Washington. Now, the reason it's never happened before is that it cannot be done. The Constitution does not permit a state legislature to do what Donald Trump wants the Michigan state legislature to do. The state legislature has already prescribed the manner in which the electors in 2020 were to be chosen, and that is through the popular vote. They cannot, after the fact, turn around and change those rules retroactively, and they can't do so for a couple of reasons. One of them is that under federal law, the date for the selection of electors was fixed November 3rd, period. End of story under federal law. And they cannot turn around and on another date, well after that date is passed, decide to move to a different mechanism for selecting the electors from that state. The popular vote governs. That was the system in place on November 3rd, and that is the system that is going to produce the slate of the Biden-Harris electors that go to Washington, D.C. But in any event, even if they were to ignore the federal statute, disregard the fact that November 3rd is behind us, and attempt by some mechanism here in the state legislature to send Trump-Pence electors to replace the Biden-Harris electors or to compete with them before the Congress, they couldn't do that either because they would be violating the Constitution, the constitutional guarantees of the right to vote and the constitutional due process clause. And that's presumably why Republican state legislative leaders have said in Pennsylvania, as well as in Michigan, that they wouldn't do that. And the Michigan state legislative leaders who are going to Washington today are on record, having said that they're going to follow the law, and the law provides that the popular vote is to be respected in the appointment of electors who meet on December 14th to cast their votes and whose votes are counted in the Congress on January 6th. So much for state legislative intervention. Not possible, not legal, not constitutional, cannot happen. So let's talk about certification delays. There's been some question about whether or not the Trump campaign can successfully delay certifications in a way that casts some doubt over the operation of the balance of this process. But they can't do that either because state law provides deadlines for votes to be certified, and those deadlines are enforceable. All of those deadlines fall before December 14th when the electors meet to cast their votes. So the attempt to delay may be undertaken, but it won't be successful. And on the timeline in front of us, cannot stop the electors from meeting to cast the ballots that they will cast that will decide who the next president will be. And that will be Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president. Now, I just want to note that that is the context in which the Trump campaign and Donald Trump have been attempting to challenge this election. What we've also seen as their claims collapse and as they turn to a purely political case, that the political claims they're making are bordering on the ludicrous and the absolutely comic. Anybody who wanted to treat themselves to the theater of the absurd almost certainly tuned in for the press conference attended by Rudy Giuliani, Jenna Ellis, and Sidney Powell. They held a press conference at the headquarters of the Republican National Committee. They said the election was fraudulently engineered through communist money that was funneled through Venezuela, Cuba, and likely China. They raised questions about voting machinery that's in use actually in 28 states, including states that Donald Trump won. It was an embarrassment to everybody concerned, but that's where we are. That's all the president has got at this point. One last word about recounts, and then I'll conclude. As I said in an earlier press briefing, recounts do not change the outcome of the election, where the margins are where they are at the moment. Sometimes they'll move a few hundred votes here, sometimes a little bit more. There's no chance, and not over decades of experience with recounts, have recounts produced votes in a number sufficient to overcome the margin in any of these contested states. Now in Georgia, the Trump campaign, which has brought 4 lawsuits and lost all 4, wanted a statewide recount. That recount was performed and it confirmed a Biden-Harris victory. And the Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, issued a press release yesterday and concluded that, and I quote, this Republican Secretary of State, "The audit confirmed the original result of the election, namely that Joe Biden won the presidential contest in the state of Georgia." Now, in Wisconsin, as you know, the Trump campaign has also requested a recount, but targeted to only 2 heavily Democratic cities, counties, in fact, Milwaukee and Dane. Again, no hope of changing the outcome on the margin in Wisconsin. No allegations substantiated in any way to suggest that the results that have been so far reported out of those counties are not correct. And the same thing is true about an election contest that the Trump campaign has filed in Nevada. The bottom line is this, the conclusion is this, the election is over. And everybody outside of that small circle that includes Donald Trump and Jenna Ellis and Rudy Giuliani knows that the election is over. The head of the Chamber of Commerce, Tom Donahue, just recently said that Trump should not delay the transition to the presidency of Joe Biden a moment longer. Karl Rove, well-known Republican strategist, key strategist to George W. Bush, wrote an op-ed entitled "The Election Result Won't Be Overturned." And Sheldon Adelson's newspaper, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, on November 11th, and I mentioned Adelson is one of Donald Trump's most ardent supporters who through October 14th of this election year had already spent $183 million to elect Donald Trump and other Republican candidates. His newspaper said that the president was doing a disservice to voters by insisting that he won the November 3rd election and was the victim of fraud. Quote, "That's simply false," unquote. And finally, I would add, because I think it's somewhat poignant, that the New York Post, as friendly a newspaper to Donald Trump as you'll find, said on November 7 that it undermined faith in the democracy for the president to continue to push baseless conspiracies. And it advised the president, get Rudy Giuliani off TV. Well, the president has now put Giuliani back on TV. That tells you everything that you need to know. So harm to the democracy through the unprecedented actions of this feckless this feckless president who has defamed the voters, defamed election officials, and made a series of increasingly extraordinary statements and unsubstantiated statements about fraud in this election. Yes, that's harmful to the democracy. Chance of success? Absolutely zero. So thank you for your attention, and I'm glad to take a few questions.
Hey, Bob, this is Mike Scheer. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Okay, thanks for doing this. So, two quick questions. One, does what the president is doing today by inviting the Michigan legislators to the White House, how much does that concern you? Is it illegal? Do you think it's improper? How serious do you think of a threat that kind of political arm twisting is? And your comments suggest that you feel like the rest of the world outside the bubble of Washington has kind of moved on. Understanding that the election is over. If that's true, what is it that Joe Biden can do to take advantage of that in this moment, and to take advantage of, what from over the next 60 days or so, what does he need to do to be able to move forward politically and policy wise, taking advantage of the fact that world leaders and other people outside of the Trump circle have concluded that it's over too? How can he seize that opportunity?
Well, let me answer your first question. Am I concerned about Donald Trump's conduct in calling legislative leaders to Washington? Of course. It's an abuse of office. It's an open attempt to intimidate election officials. It's absolutely appalling. Actually, in the context of all these losses and the record of failure that I just described, it's also pathetic. But having said all of that, it will be unsuccessful. And so it's a classic example, or maybe I'll just say it's a good example of what I was saying at the beginning and have tried to say throughout, which is, on the one hand, this is really very harmful to the democratic process and it naturally troubles people a great deal. On the other hand, it's doomed to failure. There's nothing that I can imagine that is more beneath the president of the United States than to be haranguing officials, local officials in the case of Wayne County in Michigan, state level officials in this case, to try to at least give people the impression that there's a possibility that he will still win the election. It's beyond him. This kind of pressure, this raw political pressure, is obviously outrageous. But as I said, it's also pathetic because it cannot be successful. Your second question calls on me to speak a little bit outside of my field of expertise, my remit. But I will only say this. You've seen over the last several days Donald Trump hold up in the White House consulting with people like Rudy Giuliani and, basically hatching conspiracy theories about Venezuela and China. And you've seen President-elect Biden meeting on a bipartisan basis with governors, addressing the public health emergency, and acting like the president-elect that he is and the president that he soon will be.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Hi, it's Jennifer Rubin. Thanks for doing this. Just to follow up briefly on Michael's question, is what the president is doing and what allegedly happened with Senators Lindsey Graham illegal? And should there be any kind of investigation? And secondly, could you talk a little bit about the attempt apparently to disenfranchise, in particular, African-American voters? I believe Mr. Giuliani the other day said that if you just left out Wayne County, they would win Michigan. Yes.
Well, let me answer the second one first, and I'll go to the first one. The targeting of the African-American community is not subtle. It is extraordinary. I think it points up again the importance of voting rights protections that unfortunately some of which have been allowed to lapse. And that will certainly be a subject, I think, of active reform discussion in the not too distant future. I suspect that that's the case. But I think it's quite remarkable how brazen that is. And yes, it is very, very disturbing. I also think, like so much of what they've done here, it frames their effort in such a way that they're just dooming themselves. I mean, in every respect, this entire disenfranchisement exercise, whether it is cast at the entire process, whether it's directed at the entire process, or in this case, targeted in a disgraceful way, discriminatorily at African-American voters, completely undermines any legitimacy whatsoever to a candidate who might otherwise, have legitimate claims to make in a recount or arguments to raise in litigation. This is, straight out discriminatory behavior, straight out fraudulent pleadings in court, completely baseless allegations of fraud. And it's one of the reasons why I think, understanding law, judges apply the law, and I think judges do apply the law, that judges aware of what's taking place both inside and outside the courtroom are just simply rejecting this assault on the democratic process for the reason that you cited and for all the reasons that I tried to cover earlier. As to the question of Lindsey Graham and his behavior, I think people will have to sort out, at this point, what we expect from elected officials, the legal and ethical implications of what he has done here, and in particular, by the way, that he has delivered an account of what happened that was apparently incorrect, falsified, and refuted not just by the Secretary of State of Georgia, but by the people who apparently were on the call with him, certainly raises a whole host of questions about his conduct. I won't address them here today, but I think that it is pretty clear that it is conduct that is inconsistent with the obligations of the United States Senator, and others can address themselves to, I think, a whole set of other issues around how we would interpret that conduct and how it measures up to other obligations that he may have.
And just to follow up, is the president's actions in apparently attempting to strong-arm the Michigan state legislators and the other day calling up the one of the Republicans on the Wayne County Board of Canvassers, is that illegal? Does that violate conspiracy laws or fraud laws or any other kind of laws?
Those questions certainly have been raised about his obligations. There's certainly normative obligations that he has as the President of the United States that he's violating every day in this assault on the electoral process. There has been speculation and some discussion about whether it's worse than that and that he is transgressing against at least some interpretation of his legal obligations. I'll leave that to another day. I think what I'm focused on at the moment is having everybody understand what this is really all about. Along the way, his actions raise questions, but in sum, I think we just have to be deeply disturbed by what he is doing, while at the same time remaining mindful that he cannot succeed.
Thanks very much.
Certainly, thank you.
Thanks for doing this call. I appreciate it. This is Dave Boucher with the Detroit Free Press. You've talked about this a little bit, but can you speak a little bit more about the Biden campaign's role on what happens if and when the Michigan State Board of Canvassers is deadlocked on Monday and they vote 2-2 and therefore don't certify the statewide results? Where do you think the campaign comes into play if and when that happens?
We're confident, by the way, that by the normal operation of the Michigan legal process, this is going to get sorted out and these votes are going to be certified. And there are a variety of ways that this can happen. We'd have to assume in the first instance, we'd have to hope in the first instance, that those who have a clear-cut duty to certify the votes, a clear-cut duty to do so. And we're not going to assume at the moment that they won't. If they don't, there are legal avenues to enforce the obligation to certify these votes. One way or the other, the votes will be certified. I can assure you about that. These votes will be certified, and these electoral votes will go on a certified basis into the column for Vice President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris.
Great. For our last question, we're going to go to Kristen Welker.
Hey guys, I'm so sorry. Kristen stepped away. This is Amanda Golden with NBC. The question we had was just at what point, if the GSA does not move forward with ascertainment, at what point do you start to take legal action? Say you get to January 19th. At what point is it becoming too late?
As you know, the Biden-Harris transition is progressing. However, there is a legal obligation here. And you probably know that yesterday or last night, the House of Representatives leadership with oversight and appropriations responsibility for the GSA joined, by the way, a previous statement from a large number of United States senators that they expect an accounting for the reasons for this ascertainment not having been made. It's clear it should have been made. It is clear it is a requirement of the law. And the expectation is that it will be satisfied. And I think it's been very clear that should, for whatever reason, this delay continue indefinitely, I mean, there are other routes. Certainly the Congress is intending to pursue one. There are others. Right now, the transition is progressing, but that is a question that is going to have to be resolved. So we'll see how that develops.
I believe that was our last question. So thanks everyone for attending. That's it for today.
Thank you very much.